a small Puritan village, a spark of fear, and the rise of one of the most infamous witch hunts in history. The year was 1692, and Salem, Massachusetts became the epicenter of hysteria, accusations, and executions. In this video, we'll explore what really happened during the Salem Witch Trials, how it began, who was involved, and why it still haunts the American conscience over 300 years later. The Salem Witch Trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused. Not everyone who was accused during that time had a known residency. Around 151 people, nearly half that were accused, were able to be traced back to 25 different New England communities. 30 people were found guilty, 19 of whom were executed by hanging, 14 women and 5 men. One other man, Giles Corey, died under torture after refusing to enter a plea, and at least 5 people died in the disease-ridden jails. Arrests were made in numerous towns beyond Salem Village, known today as Danvers, and its regional center, Salemtown, notably in Andover and Topsfield. The grand juries and trials for this capital crime were conducted by a court of oyer and terminer in 1692 and by a superior court of judicature in 1693, both held in Salem town, where the hangings also took place. It was the deadliest witch hunt in the history of colonial North America. 14 other women and 2 men were executed in Massachusetts and Connecticut during the 17th century. The Salem Witch Trials only came to an end when serious doubts began to arise among leading clergymen about the validity of the spectral evidence that had been used to justify so many of the convictions, and due to the sheer number of those accused, including several prominent citizens of the colony. In the years after the trials, several of the accusers, mostly teenage girls, admitted that they had fabricated their charges. In 1702, the General Court of Massachusetts declared the trials unlawful, and in 1711, the Massachusetts legislature annulled the convictions, passing a bill mentioning 22 individuals by name and reversing their attainders. While witch trials had begun to fade out across much of Europe by the mid-17th century, they continued on the fringes of Europe and in the American colonies. The events in 1692 to 1693 in Salem became a brief outburst of a sort of hysteria in the New World, while the practice was already waning in most of Europe. In 1668, and against modern sadism, Joseph Glanville claimed that he could prove the existence of witches and ghosts of the supernatural realm. Glanville wrote about the denial of the bodily resurrection and the spirits. In his treatise, Glanville claimed that ingenious men should believe in witches and apparitions. If they doubted the reality of spirits, they not only denied demons but also the Almighty God. Glanville wanted to prove that the supernatural could not be denied. Those who did deny apparitions were considered heretics, for it also disproved their beliefs in angels. Works by men such as Glanville and Cotton Mather tried to prove that demons were alive in Salem Village in February 1692. Betty Paris, age 9, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, the daughter and the niece, respectively, of Reverend Samuel Paris, began to have fits described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to affect by John Hale, the minister of the nearby town of Beverly. 45. The girls screamed, threw things about the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions, according to the eyewitness account of Reverend Deodat Lawson, a former minister in Salem Village. The girls complained of being pinched and pricked with pins. A doctor, historically assumed to be William Griggs, could find no physical evidence of any ailment. Other young women in the village began to exhibit similar behaviors. When Lawson preached as a guest in the Salem Village Meeting House, he was interrupted several times by the outbursts of the afflicted. The first 3 people accused and arrested for allegedly afflicting Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Hubbard were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Some historians believe that the accusation by Ann Putnam Jr. suggests that a family feud may have been a major cause of the witch trials. At the time, a vicious rivalry was underway between the Putnam and Porter families, one which deeply polarized the people of Salem. Citizens would often have heated debates, which escalated into full-fledged fighting, based solely on their opinion of the feud. Some of the physical symptoms resembled convulsive ergot poisoning, proposed 284 years later. Sarah Good was a destitute woman accused of witchcraft because of her reputation. At her trial, she was accused of rejecting Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline when she chose to torment and scorn children instead of leading them toward the path of salvation. Sarah Osborne rarely attended church meetings. She was accused of witchcraft because the Puritans believed that Osborne had her own self-interest in mind following her remarriage to an indentured servant. The citizens of the town disapproved of her trying to control her son's inheritance from her previous marriage. Tituba, an enslaved South American Kalina woman from the West Indies, likely became a target because of her ethnic differences from most of the other villagers. She was accused of attracting girls like Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, with stories of enchantment from Malleus Maleficarum. These tales about sexual encounters with demons, swaying the minds of men, and fortune-telling were said to stimulate the imaginations of girls and made Tituba an obvious target of accusations. Each of these women was a kind of outcast and exhibited many of the character traits typical of the usual suspects for witchcraft accusations. They were left to defend themselves. Brought before the local magistrates on the complaint of witchcraft, they were interrogated for several days, starting on March 1st, 1692, then sent to jail. In March, others were accused of witchcraft: Martha Corey, child Dorothy Good, and Rebecca Nurse in Salem Village, and Rachel Clinton in nearby Ipswich. Martha Corey had expressed skepticism about the credibility of the girls' accusations, and thus drawn attention. The charges against her and Rebecca Nurse deeply troubled the community because Martha Corey was a full covenanted member of the church in Salem Village, as was Rebecca Nurse in the church in Salem Town. If such upstanding people could be witches, the townspeople thought, then anybody could be a witch, and church membership was no protection from accusation. Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, was only 4 years old but was not exempted from questioning by the magistrates. Her answers were construed as a confession that implicated her mother. In Ipswich, Rachel Clinton was arrested for witchcraft at the end of March on independent charges, unrelated to the afflictions of the girls in Salem Village. The initial examinations included physical exams where the accused were examined for unique markings such as moles, birthmarks that were commonly believed to be associated with the devil's influence. It was thought that those markings represented the devil drinking the accused women's blood. Within a week, Giles Corey, Martha's husband and a covenanted church member in Salem Town, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, a servant in the Proctor household and sometime accuser, and Deliverance Hobbs, stepmother of Abigail Hobbs, were arrested and examined. Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs all confessed and began naming additional people as accomplices. More arrests followed: Sarah Wilds, William Hobbs, husband of Deliverance and father of Abigail, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., Mary Easty, sister of Cloyce and nurse, Edward Bishop Jr. and his wife Sarah Bishop, and Mary English. On April 30th, Reverend George Burroughs, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hoare, Sarah Morey, and Philip English, Mary's husband, were arrested. Nehemiah Abbott Jr. was released because the accusers agreed he was not the person whose specter had afflicted them. Mary Easty was released for a few days after her initial arrest because the accusers failed to confirm that it was she who had afflicted them. She was arrested again when the accusers reconsidered. In May, accusations continued to pour in, but some of the suspects began to evade apprehension. Multiple warrants were issued before John Willard and Elizabeth Colson were apprehended. George Jacobs Jr. and Daniel Andrews were not caught. Until this point, all the proceedings were investigative, but on May 27, 1692, William Phipps ordered the establishment of a special court of oyer and terminer for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties to prosecute the cases of those in jail. Warrants were issued for more people. Sarah Osborne, one of the first 3 persons accused, died in jail on May 10, 1692. 81-year-old farmer from the southeast end of Salem, called Salem Farms, refused to enter a plea when he came to trial in September. The judges applied an archaic form of punishment called pena forte e dura, in which stones were piled on his chest until he could no longer breathe. After 2 days of pain forte dura, Corey died without entering a plea. His refusal to plead is usually explained as a way of preventing his estate from being confiscated by the Crown. But according to historian Chadwick Hansen, much of Corey's property had already been seized, and he had made a will in prison. His death was a protest against the methods of the court. A contemporary critic of the trials, Robert Clef, wrote, "Giles Corey pleaded not guilty to his indictment, but would not put himself upon trial by the jury, they having cleared none upon trial, and knowing there would be the same witnesses against him, rather chose to undergo what death they would put him to." As convicted witches, Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey had been excommunicated from their churches and denied proper burials. As soon as the bodies of the accused were cut down from the trees, they were thrown into a shallow grave, and the crowd dispersed. Oral history claims that the families of the dead reclaimed their bodies after dark and buried them in unmarked graves on family property. The record books of the time do not note the deaths of any of those executed. According to a March 27, 1692 entry by Paris in the records of the Salem Village Church, a church member and close neighbor of Reverend Paris, Mary Sibley, aunt of Mary Walcott, directed John Indian, a man enslaved by Paris, to make a witch cake. This may have been a superstitious attempt to ward off evil spirits. According to an account attributed to Deodat Lawson, collected by Deodat Lawson, this happened around March 8th, over a week after the first complaints had gone out and 3 women were arrested. Lawson's account describes this cake, a means to discover witchcraft. Mather quickly completed his account of the trials, Wonders of the Invisible World, and it was given to Phipps when he returned from the fighting in Maine in early October. Burr says both Phipps's letter and Mather's manuscript must have gone to London by the same ship. In mid-October, I hereby declare that as soon as I came from fighting and understood what danger some of their innocent subjects might be exposed to, if the evidence of the afflicted persons only did prevail either to the committing or trying any of them, I did before any application was made unto me, about it put a stop to the proceedings of the court, and they are now stopped till their majesties' pleasure be known. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of the most infamous chapters in early American history, and scholars have long debated what truly fueled the hysteria. At the core were deeply rooted religious convictions, Puritan beliefs that emphasized the existence of the devil and the ever-present threat of sin. In a society where spiritual purity was paramount, even minor deviations from social norms could be interpreted as evidence of evil influence. This religious intensity, combined with the widespread superstitions of the 17th century, created a fertile ground for paranoia and fear. Mass hysteria likely played a critical role as well. The strange behaviors of a few young girls, convulsions, strange speech, or trances, may have spread quickly through psychological contagion. Witnessing peers display alarming symptoms may have convinced other impressionable individuals, especially children, that they too were under some supernatural attack. Such psychosomatic responses, common in group hysteria, can easily take hold in isolated, high-stress communities. Another plausible explanation lies in the social dynamics and power struggles within Salem Village itself. The community was far from unified. It was marked by deep divisions among influential families who competed for control and influence. Some historians argue that these rivalries were exploited, consciously or unconsciously, by those close to the accusers. The parents of the afflicted girls may have seen an opportunity to eliminate political or personal enemies by fanning the flames of witchcraft accusations. There are also biological theories that attempt to explain the odd behavior. One hypothesis suggests that the townspeople may have consumed rye grain contaminated with Claviceps purpurea, a type of fungus known as ergot. Ergot produces chemicals similar to LSD, and consuming moldy rye could induce hallucinations, muscle spasms, and delirium, symptoms consistent with those described by witnesses during the trials. Additionally, some scholars propose that the girls were not victims at all, but rather aware of the fear they inspired and relished the influence they wielded. In a rigid society where young girls had virtually no autonomy, the sudden ability to influence the actions of adults, including religious leaders and court officials, could have been intoxicating. By making accusations, they could exact revenge, gain attention, or simply feel a sense of control over their constrained lives. Whatever the true combination of causes, the witch trials spiraled beyond rational control. By the time the chaos subsided in May of 1693, 20 people had been executed, and countless others had suffered imprisonment, social ruin, or lifelong trauma. Salem Village would never be the same. The event served as a chilling reminder of how fear, ideology, and unresolved tensions can converge to tragic effect, leaving behind a legacy that continues to captivate and caution generations.